we are glad to see the improvement in our trade in the month of June, where export increased by 8% in June. And in fact, even more encouraging is that we saw export continue to rise in July by 3.1%. So there have been 2 consecutive months of increase in our export. That's for the month of June and July. In the first half of this year, Jan to June, trade declined by about 7%, and export declined by about 6.8%. So I think, as far as I'm concerned, the worst is over. The major decline in our trade and export actually took place in April and in May, where export, for example, fell by over 20%. It's a huge decline, simply because we had MCO, which started from 18th of March. And it went on, and of course at that time we know that very limited industries were allowed to operate. Only essential industries or industries that produce essential products were allowed to operate. At the same time, there were also lockdowns all over the world because everyone tried to contain the spread of COVID-19, and that very much affected the global supply chain, not only in Malaysia but all over the world. Supply chain here, we are not talking about exporting from Malaysia only, but we're talking about import of raw materials and components. Malaysia is an open economy. Our trade account for about 121% of our GDP. So which means our trade numbers are bigger than our GDP numbers, value, So because we are open, we depend quite a bit also on import in order to export. We are sort of a manufacturing country. Our manufacturing export accounted for about 87% of our total export. So global supply chain was badly affected and eventually affected Malaysia. That's why we saw a big drop in our trade and export in the month of April and May. So I don't foresee anything like that will happen in the next few months, or rather in the second half of this year. So I would expect that the performance for trade and export would be much better compared to the first half. But we still need to be cautious with the potential of outbreak of the second or third wave again if we are not very careful. That's why I think it is very important for Malaysians to strictly adhere to SOP that government has enforced. So we don't want to see government going back to introducing a strict MCO again. So all in all, to answer your question just now, is that we expect a better performance in the second half of this year compared to the first half.
So what will be the factor driven by this good performance instead of the opening back of the all industries?
Yeah, opening of I think right now most of the industries are allowed to operate, especially in the manufacturing sector. 1. 2, the logistic operations in the country have been allowed for quite a while already. So movement of goods and all that sort of came back to normal. But there are still lockdowns in other countries. We know also that some countries reintroduced lockdowns, if not for the whole country, but for certain major states or areas in those countries. And that will also affect the operations of the manufacturing activity in those countries where they import products or components from Malaysia for their manufacturing operations. 1. 2 is we acknowledge also there have been a decline in global spending. Consumers are not spending. I'm not talking consumers in Malaysia, but consumers all over the world are not spending as much as they did prior to COVID. So global demand has gone down. We know also that WTO projected that trade to decline by between 13 to 32% this year. They have not revised the numbers yet, but that numbers was predicted at the peak of COVID in the month of March or April last time. So we are still subject to the global situation in terms of a pandemic, in terms of global demand, in terms of what's going on in those major countries that are our major trading partners.
So as you mentioned, the second half performance trades and also export could be better than the first half. So when is the trade and also export will back to the normal momentum?
No, like I said, started in June. Exports increased by about 8% and continue in July by 3.1%. So we hope this momentum will continue. Perhaps not at the rate we saw in June, but it would be better than the first half. I guess, yeah.
What will be the major contributor of the sector to the July numbers?
July, okay, June first. June because what do you call it? Following the opening of the economy, logistic operations and all that. So there were major shipments took place in June because prior to that there were some restrictions in terms of manufacturing activities, in terms of logistic operations. So that's one. Number two, we are seeing also that there have been increase in demand for electronic products. We know that tech companies have become major winners, while many sectors are negatively affected, but tech companies are enjoying the benefits of the pandemic. So again, because Malaysia is a major player in the production and export of electrical electronics, our electronic exports accounted for about 38% of our total export. So we are a major player, so we are also benefiting from that trend.